Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is October 27, 2023. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Josh Gellers. Josh, where in the heck are you calling in from?
I'm in right now sunny Jacksonville, Florida.
How cool is that? I want to thank Piers Stevens for introducing us. And the first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
Wow. Um, I think it's to be part of something greater than yourself and to contribute positively to that.
I like that. Something greater than yourself and contribute towards that. Beautiful. What's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
Probably reading newspapers online.
Wow, that's heavy. So, did you become a reader? One, because your parents told you to, two, they did as an example, or three, on your own?
My parents are both really avid readers, but there was also a bit of peer pressure maybe. And I remember in elementary school, it was I think I was in first grade, and the teacher asked everyone who can read and just asked for people to raise their hands. And I didn't want to be embarrassed. So I raised my hand, even though I could at that time not really read that well. But honestly, that kind of put me on a trajectory for some higher level reading because they assumed that I was coming equipped and ready to do that. And so I was sort of tracked from then on in higher level reading at the elementary school level because I was too embarrassed to say that I couldn't read.
Dude, that's the most watched TED Talk is fake it to make it.
I bet. I lived it.
I lived it. Why do you think humans collect or gather information?
I think that telling stories is an innate human characteristic, and also that humans want to preserve memories and the emotions associated with those memories. So, recording information, sharing information is a way to kind of keep those memories alive.
Well, that's interesting. The next question was, is this need or want to collect information more innate or more invented?
I think it's innate. I mean, we have, I'm not an anthropologist, but we definitely have cultures throughout history that pass on traditions, stories through, oral histories. Uh, we know that there are whole languages that aren't written down anywhere, and that's a kind of almost mimetic or genetic way of continuing traditions and cultures. And so I think that you could look across time and space and find that that's something that humans tend to engage in.
Brilliant, Josh. I really appreciate this. You've got ESP because you sort of anticipated this question. Do thoughts create emotions?
I think they can, but it's not sufficient. So you can be inspired to emote on the basis of a thought, which is something that actors do. But you can also be brought to emotion through sort of pure phenomenological experience without having to have any kind of deliberation or foresight.
Fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I
Research it.
Nice. No one ever says that. Good. I'm on that route.
Yeah,
Research it. Now, what a great word too. Research.
right. Hopefully, it's not the first time or the last time.
Can humans think without language?
I think that there are, especially people who have certain disabilities that maybe have not had the opportunity to develop their language skills, but they are still cognitively capable of generating thoughts and ideas and even having maybe novel ways of expressing those, whether it's through, sort of physical gestures or um, just, even the way that they look at something. So I think I was a faculty sponsor for a student group called Leaders and Activists for the Disabled. And it was led by a student who had a very severe visual impairment, even though she didn't have she wasn't deaf or mute. It still really opened my eyes to the fact that having a disability in one area doesn't necessarily close the door for other types of physical or cognitive ways of interacting with the world. And so I think that the answer would be yes, that there's still ways of conjuring thoughts, even if you're not able to articulate them in the form of language.
Really good. My nephew's that way. We're walking down the street and, most people won't acknowledge this, dirty wino homeless person or whatever. And he'll go, hi, and it's like, dude, why can't the world be like this? And his sister nailed it. He says, Micah isn't special needs. He's special abilities.
And I think there's a move away from special needs as far as I understand now.
Yeah. Yeah. No, my family's in that world, and they says, I'm always asking, well, what do you call it now? And they go, neurodiversity. And I was like, well, everybody's neurally diverse.
Sure.
Chomsky says the language is not just words. It's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
I think you have to have mutual experiences where emotions and connectivity guide people's ability to affiliate with one another and understand and empathize.
Yeah. Your observations of humans in general, are we more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
I think it probably varies. I think that there are people who are a lot more inclined to think and maybe are less interested in relating to other people. And then there's other people who are much more emotive, much more empathetic. Even my wife is, I think, probably a, kind of archetype for that sort of person. She sort of has this innate, strong ability to feel what other people are feeling and kind of soak that up like a sponge. And I think we need people like that in the world who can have that very deep way of relating to other people, even if it's not, purely intellectual, but it's more on a kind of emotional level.
Yeah. It's funny, Josh, because 80% of people go, we're more feeling beings. And Bridget Bardot said, when I make love, I don't think. And it's like, good luck. So, it really is. It's like you can't separate feeling from thinking, but you did it well there. But we think we can because we invented the words.
Sure.
Oh, this is more feeling, this is more thinking. So these are two questions from Alan Turing in 1950s. One, is thinking a function of the soul?
So as a social scientist, I deal with evidence and testing hypotheses, and a soul is the kind of thing that we would consider in social science parlance to be non-falsifiable, which means you can't really prove that it doesn't exist. So you can't also prove that it does exist, and it kind of leaves you in this sort of gray, murky area. So I wouldn't be inclined to agree that you need a soul, because I don't think we've proven that that is something that everyone possesses to begin with.
Yeah. Really good. The second Turing question is, can machines think?
So this one's a little bit more in my wheelhouse. And it depends on whether you take the perspective that the brain does something completely different and unique to form thoughts, or whether it's simply a series of processes, a kind of almost electronic series of events that have to occur. And these two schools of thought disagree, as you might imagine, about this issue of whether a machine is capable of thinking or being conscious or sentient or anything like that. And so where I come down on this is, I think And we can look at examples, although they're very sort of rudimentary, relatively speaking, that things like neural networks demonstrate that there is a kind of way that we can model the architecture of the way in which a human mind functions, and we can replicate that even to ways that exceed current human computing capacities. So I think in the sense of whether if our brains are machines, then I think yes, machines are capable of thinking.
Yeah. Really good with words, Josh. I appreciate this. And you're the first one to try this next Turing line out. He
Okay.
said, what we want is a machine that can learn from experience.
We already have some researchers who are able to create robots based on sort of unsupervised training, where you just give them a bunch of data, some parameters, they kind of figure it out on their own, and then they can actually design robots and the way that robots are supposed to behave. So I think that that's Turing, well ahead of his time once again, that's a very plausible way of thinking about it.
Yeah. And I love the first three words, what we want. He's like sort of defining what, well, do all humans want that? What we want, and who is the we there?
Mm-hmm.
But here's McLuhan. Everybody experiences far more than they understand. Yet, it is experience rather than understanding that influences behavior. Now, the way I interpret that is what I'm going to say first. Then I would like you to tell me your thoughts on my interpretation and what you think Marshall might have felt.
Mm-hmm.
The way I feel it is, he's saying is, if the kid comes in from the cold and the parent goes, don't touch the stove, it will burn your hand. That's experience. If the parent goes, let me teach you the dynamics of heat, you can get your hands really close to the stove, rub them, and get your hands warm. So Marshall seems to me is saying understanding should shape our behavior, but experience tends to more shape our behavior.
I agree that I think that experience is a more able teacher, um, and not everyone's going to be receptive to breaking things down in a way that is technical or formulaic. So um, it's almost like talking about love and heartbreak. It's very easy to tell someone how to get over a heartbreak. It's much more different and difficult to be in the throes of heartbreak and to get over it yourself. And I think you almost have to consciously remind yourself of the experiences you have to acknowledge how difficult it was, even when you could intellectualize it, that it may be difficult and exceed your capacity to think about something, because when you feel it, there's nothing quite like feeling it in the first place.
Yeah. So you're saying it's sort of like feeling and thinking, that experience and understanding are sort of hard to pull apart and say they're different. They're so interconnected that you
Mm-hmm.
can't really separate them.
Well, it's really difficult, but I think that experience is something that everyone's capable of doing, and sort of intellectualizing something and explaining it to somebody,
Yeah.
only a much smaller subset of the population is going to be able to run with that.
Yeah.
Um, so experience is the best teacher, I think.
Yeah. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
I would say meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a professor, and I think even if it's things that are not in my area of research, I find that I have this sort of constant thirst for trying to understand things that I don't myself really fully understand. And so that leads to, reading and researching and talking to people. And I feel like I'm always on this sort of constant quest toward truth. And so I think that's probably more along the lines of where I fall on that.
Does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're more so detecting it or more so creating it?
Well, there's another school of thought, panpsychism, which says that actually consciousness exists outside the body altogether and is something we kind of tap into. And there's some interesting research that I read recently about how infants learn about their own agency, and it suggests that there's a sort of uh, dialogical relationship between the mind, the environment, and the sort of physical substrate of the infant itself. And so I think that consciousness is very heavily debated right now in the philosophical world, in the artificial intelligence world. And you will find right now diametrically opposed views about what consciousness is. And I'm certainly not a consciousness scholar or expert, but my own take on it is that it is something that emerges in the course of biophysical processes and is also influenced by what happens in our external environment.
That's the New York article recently was, can babies inside the womb dream?
Mm.
Because they haven't had any like outside experience yet.
Mm-hmm.
So they probably have some sort of dream, but it's not defined in the way we kind of think we can describe what a dream is.
Yeah, it might be very limited to what their lived experience has been thus far.
Yeah.
And so they might be dreaming of, you know, being on an island, or I mean, they wouldn't know what the conception of an island is, but being afloat or something like that might
Being
be,
afloat.
yeah,
That's
just that
funny
sense.
because my friend who's blind since birth, his partner says, well, he doesn't see black or white.
Mm-hmm.
I says, what does he see in his mind's eye? He says, empty.
Mm-hmm.
Because he can literally put his hand into a bucket of water and feel the water. And then you can pour the water out and you go, well, now the water's gone. So maybe that's what he sees as empty. But,
Mm.
how do you describe
Yeah,
what you see if you've never seen anything?
that would be great for an oral history for the Library of Congress.
What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
Speed of light.
You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. That's the poet Audre Lorde. Yvonne Rainer said, you can if you expose the tools.
Hmm.
What new tool do you suggest?
I think I don't have a new tool, but I think that exposing the logical fallacies of arguments raised by other people and having people value the role that logic plays in argumentation is a way to dismantle misinformation, disinformation, and hate and confusing speech.
Yeah. What new toy do you suggest?
I think I'm really interested, although I haven't done a whole lot in this area, with virtual reality. But
Yeah.
I work with someone who does virtual reality based research involving the environment, and I just think it's really cool to be able to transport someone and make them feel like they're actually in the Louvre or in a swamp or in the Middle Ages or something like that. I think that has maybe more potential even than sort of the metaverse for revolutionizing the way that we experience and understand things.
Yeah. No, medical and architects. When VR came out years ago, they said I can walk you through the building without looking at diagrams. In medical, you can do major. Okay, what do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
I worry about a lot of things, including if we're ever, as a society, going to be able to communicate effectively and empathically. Because right now, social media discourse, I feel like I'm screaming into a void sometimes because people are so dedicated to their team, but not necessarily listening to other people. And you can be right, and you can even point out the flaws in opposing perspectives, but the fidelity to the team is so great that it overrides the willingness to listen. And
Wow,
so I think a lot about that.
that's heavy. Because, we're talking about team shut down your ability to hear the other point of view. But there's that commonality and community that you want when you imply when you hear the word team, it implies this togetherness. That's really good. That we call that suspended judgment. McLuhan said, understanding is not having a point of view.
Mm.
But we probably think we're hardwired to have a bias, to have a point of view.
Yeah, and I think that from what I understand of the anthropological literature, that there's an evolutionary purpose for that. It's preservation of self and the community,
Yeah.
but that may prohibit the ability to relate to those that we consider outside of our in group.
Yeah. McLuhan learned from Pound the poet that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, so we might be able to cope with what we don't like about our inventions. So, Josh, I asked you the question McLuhan probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
I think it's because it's deeply uncomfortable to think about things that we might not like to hear.
Yeah.
And artists play an essential role at the sort of vanguard of society to have the freedom to play around with ideas and expressions and to challenge our preconceived notions. And I think that that's more important than ever.
Yeah. Do artists have moral obligation?
I think the question I would ask, to whom would they have that moral
Yeah.
obligation? Because there's lots of art that has been considered heretical or blasphemous that by today's standards wouldn't be, but it has served a purpose to maybe shed light on very dangerous and harmful power relations. And we see the same thing kind of, in our own era. And I don't know if I want artists to not have the ability to play around with those sorts of ideas and to push the limits.
Yeah. Yeah, I watched Eric Andre on Jimmy Kimmel the other day, and it's like that dude's a sick mofo, and I mean he's gotten away, but he's very smart. And what does he do? He puts out a book. He's peddling a book. It's like that to me was saying something about the printed matter.
Mm-hmm. And he's I've watched his stand up. He is wild. I've watched a lot of stand ups. I've been to stand up shows.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever seen anything like his stand up special
Yeah.
in, I think it was New Orleans.
Yeah, no, it is brilliant.
Yeah.
But you've avoided his talk show, I'm sure.
Yeah, I haven't watched that.
Are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
I would say probably old ideas. I think new ideas allow you the opportunity to have an open discussion about whether they're practical. Old ideas, we've already had those conversations, and sometimes their reemergence is unwelcome.
Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever or one of them?
Yes. So I distinctly, although I allegedly I didn't have the cognitive ability to remember this, but in some ways, whether I was told it and then had a false memory or actually experienced it, I remember crawling on the ground in what was my maternal grandmother's apartment and seeing a glass coffee table and an ashtray. And she had been a smoker. She wasn't smoking at the time, but I've asked my mother about this, and my mother seemed to verify that that's an accurate description of my grandmother's apartment when I was very young.
Wow. Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
I think it's a blessing.
Yeah.
I think that, a person might no longer be with us, but their memory will talk about consciousness, sort of live on potentially infinitely in the minds of people who knew or loved that person. Of course, there are traumatic memories, which are not wonderful to hold on to. But I think on balance, when you think about the preservation of the human spirit and ideas and music and love and history, that overall memory has a positive role to play in passing those ideas down.
Tell me someone within your immediate family and then outside your immediate family, just briefly, who had an impact on you, kind of like a role model. And what specifically was that impact?
So within my family, um, my mom was someone who she worked for a time while she was earning her master's degree, and then she worked while she was going through the process of becoming a nationally board certified teacher. And so I watched as a working mother of two who is a professional, come home after a day, teaching at a middle school and work on her national board certification, which was almost the equivalent of like doing a master's thesis. And I think that seeing her dedication to that earlier in my life gave me kind of a model in my own life when I did an honors thesis in college and then a dissertation during my doctoral studies. Um, Outside, there's so many people that I admire, especially in the academic world. Um, but I think one person who I really admire actually is he's a scholar in Ireland named John Danaher, and I've recommended his writing to my students, and I said, here's someone who thinks so deeply about so many different things, and yet can articulate them in such a way that is logical and beautiful at the same time. And so I've actually referenced his blog and his scholarship to some students who are looking for how to become better writers. And he writes about things like being a father, which for me are very relevant to issues about academia and technology and the economy. And he's actually a legal scholar, but he sort of dabbles in philosophy. And I just find his writing to be so cogent and easy to read, but so indefensibly argued as well.
Yeah. Well, I find that.
Defensively argued, not indefensively.
Yeah. But Josh, I find that in you. You're very concise, but you're articulate and you're good with words. So, that's what it's all about. Communication is that for me. Um, did your parents raise you a particular religion?
Yes. Well, so I was raised in a Jewish household, uh, definitely culturally Jewish. My father grew up in a conservative Jewish household, and my mother grew up in more of what would be like a reform or even non-observant Jewish household, where like she didn't get bat mitzvahed, for example. But I went to Hebrew school. I was bar mitzvahed. I went to United Synagogue Youth when I was in middle school, but I kind of dropped off after that. It was not a big part of my life after that. Although my father's brother was a rabbi, and so I always had that influence as well. And he was a lawyer before he was a rabbi, so I also had some influence from him when doing some of my own studies and things that I was interested in doing research wise.
Do you pray?
No.
If God exists, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
That you weren't perfect, but you tried hard to be a good person to the people who matter to you and to your community.
Beautiful. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Oh, I think evil people exist. And I think that my father was a therapist and certainly tried to work with people who faced a lot of their own demons. But I don't know if we have the tools to be able to help everyone who has their own demons.
The real hidden question here, Josh, is how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And I'll set it up. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurai, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. It's a lot of thoughts. Basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
So that explanation or argument plays very well online because we live in this very fast sort of 24-hour news cycle, and there's always something to distract us and another crisis to attend to. So I think that if you leave someone alone, they'll basically lose interest and you won't really have an adversary anymore. But outside of that, I think that there might be ethical obligations to address some of the issues that are raised, or maybe even falsehoods that are perpetrated by an enemy. And so in those instances when you feel personally wronged or that there has been an injustice, I think that there's a moral duty actually to acknowledge and respond to the enemy.
So this is good because it gives me a chance, since you're so smart, and I follow this question with this for the last year or so, this next question. And I don't think it's worded right, and I'm having trouble. And I asked my friend today, how can I revise this question or reword it? Because I'm always about working with the person I'm interviewing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like me and you versus the wording on the questions. So sometimes people go, well, the verb should be different. Or I said, that's great. Like these more questions, my favorite was, is it more this or more that? And the woman goes, the word more doesn't function in your question. So here's what I'd say next. Nassim Taleb says games were created to give non-heroes the illusion of winning. In real life, we don't know who wins or loses, but we can tell who is a hero and who is not. Then someone said, well, villains don't think they're bad. They want control. Heroes want freedom. And Gregory Bates, an anthropologist, says when the criminal gets caught, does he go, whoa, my criminal skills weren't up to snuff that day? Or does he say, I did something morally and socially wrong? So then normally that's 3 prompts. It's too overwhelming. I just go, does punishment work? So let's just go with that first. Does punishment work?
For some people.
Yeah.
But nothing is going to work universally as a deterrent. There are going to be people, whether because of circumstance or because of how they're hardwired, who won't respond to the kinds of punitive actions that might be taken against them. And again, I sort of defer to not only my father and his work, but my mother was a probation officer for a number of years. And, she would be the first to tell you that there were some people who could be reformed and who realized the error in their ways. And that there were some people who were rotten to the core and were going to be in jail or dead. That was just it.
Wow. Because that's so, does that function after those 3 prompts as a good through line question? Does punishment work?
Well, I think there's so much more in the prompts that you gave about the role of a hero and does a villain recognize themselves as a villain, that I don't know how you bring all of that together, but I think those are also very interesting questions to ask. And I think that sure, there's some villains who have remorse, but there's also some villains that are, as we talked about before, are evil and thrive on evil and aren't looking to find out that one day they maybe have had it wrong all along. They're quite comfortable being evil. And the hero, I think the first one about games, the video game industry is larger than movies and television. And I think it's because people want to feel like they're a hero, but I don't think that necessarily discredits them and diminishes what they're experiencing in any way. And I think that it's maybe a bit heavy-handed to say that they're sort of like failed heroes or heroes that never, manifested in the right way or something like that.
Yeah, but you cannot tell who a hero is and who is not. We don't know who really wins or loses, but we can tell who is a hero and who is not. That's a little fudgy because my friend said today, instead of asking, does punishment work? You could say, is when would you kill someone or something like that? When is killing okay? And that to me is a heavy question, because
Mhm.
I do have the question that I never ask is, do you vote yes or no for capital punishment? But I don't usually ask that. But it is funny because, yeah, is killing okay?
I think
It's not the word, it's not the right wording. How would I word that so it's not like, no, killing's not okay? But if someone's jumping on you and about to kill you, do you try to kill them, or you surrender to death?
so. I think a different way of looking at it would be: is is murder ever morally justified?
That's it. That's it. Is murder and then I said, well, is murder the right word? Do we want to say murder or killing?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a term of art in this instance, but I think you could probably use either.
You, you
People would understand what you're getting at.
which word would you respond best if I asked you right now? Is murder ever justified, or is killing ever justified?
I would say murder, if only because this is actually an example that I give for illustrating a concept called incompletely theorized agreements,
Yeah,
which is by Cass Sunstein at Harvard.
yeah,
And I find this as a rhetorical or maybe a mnemonic device useful for thinking about disagreements that people have. And what it does is it's sort of like a pyramid where you
yeah,
figure out where are the disagreements that people have. And so the example that I give is exactly what you said. I
yeah,
say you start off with a very high order premise like, is murder ever morally justified or something
yeah,
like that? And then you could have, for example, a conversation with pro-choice people and uh, pro-life people,
yeah,
and get them to realize that they may actually share some views about the morality of murder or
yeah,
killing. It's just you get into the weeds of like who, when, and under what circumstances and things like that. But what it does is actually brings people together because they can realize that even though they have these diametrically opposed viewpoints on that particular topic, that maybe at the higher order of abstraction, they actually might agree.
yep. Brilliant. That was really good. You helped me a lot. Thank you.
Sure.
James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin over 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, "This is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree?" Years later, Faulkner said, "Sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?"
I think that has a lot to do with the sort of social, maybe even emotional value of art.
Yeah,
And if you look at, again, going back into antiquity, uh, our human ancestors did cave drawings. They wanted to be able to express themselves and depict what their lives were like. And so you can tell that's a very ancient tendency. So I
yeah,
think that people, that's probably another hardwired type tendency that people may have to to maybe take a mental break, but also to express and remember and to memorialize.
yeah. Yeah, there's an artist. I wonder your reaction to his quote: "Art is making your problems other people's problems." What do you
Some
think?
artists definitely ascribe by that.
Fanny Howe, the poet, says the point of art is to show people that life is worth living by showing that it isn't.
Hmm. I mean, I go to a lot of museums. Every time I travel, I try to go to typically like a modern art museum,
Yeah,
but I find myself always inspired even by dark imagery and sadness. And I think I always find it to be uplifting in a way, and it gives me a chance to pause and think outside of my immediate context, whether it's because it's a different culture or an artist I'm not familiar with. So I don't know if I would agree that any artist, or maybe some artists do, but intentionally, but even by showing the darkness of life, I feel like they're illuminating it.
yes. Leonard Cohen can't have light without a crack, So, I want to ask you about a project we're researching, and that is archiving.
Mhm.
So you've sort of used these words, preserving memory. And the basic question is archiving more innate or more invented? The word means records, documents, preserve as evidence, but it's even before that etymologically, it means keep safe, free from harm.
Mhm.
And then it's rooted in that word town hall, public building, Archon, to be the first ruler, the chief magistrate. So the Egyptians would put stuff in their coffin with them. Yet there is the philosophy of the East where it's live for the moment, be here now. That's what's important. Wyndham Lewis said it so well. He said, artists, and I think everybody, live in the moment and write a detailed history of the future.
Hmm.
So, what is this? Do you think it is innate in us to archive, or is it invented?
I think it's innate, and I think
Yeah.
that there's a certain value in trying to keep track of the past, whether it's for posterity's sake or to pass it along to the next generation, or to just have a way of revisiting something that happened and to reflect on that. So I think that, again, going back into history, that people have always done some form of it, and I think we'll continue to do that in probably increasingly novel ways. It actually reminds me of a movie called Archive, um, which is about, I'm not going to do a spoiler, but ostensibly about a husband who has uh, basically taken his wife's personality and placed it into a computer, and he's hoping to develop a robot that is sufficiently sophisticated and human-like enough to where it's sort of porting her memory and her personality back into a kind of humanoid robot so that he can interact with her and things like that. And there is a really big twist which I won't reveal, but what I think is important about that is it speaks to that desire, especially posthumously, which we have seen in people who have contracted with these like chatbot companies, to continue to even interact with on an artificial basis through like a screen someone that they loved, because holding on to that memory is good, but being able to even build more memories off of that is, I think, even more special. And so that's going to become, I think, a really big industry, is this sort of, digitally memorializing people, even if it's literally in the form of what they're trying to do with Neuralink, where maybe one day, you'll be able to download your brain onto a thumb drive, and then you die, and then you can have your brain and your memories uploaded to a computer, or potentially another physical substrate, that the world can interact with. So that to me shows like the sort of urgency and interest that humans have in continuing to archive. We're going to be archiving ourselves.
And physically, Josh, after you die, do you have plans for your own archives? You have your books, you have your research. I know it's probably mainly on digital, but there's probably a lot of physical notes too. Any plans for your own personal archives? Does your university have that sort of thing set up where they archive your stuff, or have you thought about that?
I haven't thought about it, but the thing I do think about actually quite a bit is my digital footprint, and that I hope that when I'm gone, maybe my grandchildren or great grandchildren, maybe they mentally Google their grandfather or great grandfather, and all of this positive stuff gets populated, and they can learn about who I was through the information that comes about through their searching. That's what I actually do think about.
Yeah. But do you think the internet will ever shut down and then they won't have that?
I think that there'll always be some kind of repository. How they access it will probably be very different in the future, but I don't think it's going to close down and hang up a closed sign or on the door or something like that.
Yeah. So walk us through just briefly
Mhm.
in your tipping point. Where did you go? I'm going to pursue being a social scientist, a political scientist. What are you studying in high school and college? And where was that tipping point? Is that's what I want to pursue. And besides pursuing that, to be an educator, because
Mhm.
it includes both researching and educator. So you
Mhm.
sort of both.
I think it probably began at least as early as kindergarten. My kindergarten teacher nicknamed me the little wizard,
Wow.
and I, you know, this is not to be sort of self-aggrandizing, but I had a real propensity for leadership when I was even 6 years old, and um, I would establish student organizations. I organized a foot race and gave out awards. Later in elementary school, I was a peer mediator, so like helping students to resolve conflicts. And I think maybe being an older brother, I don't know exactly what it was, but I felt almost like called to leadership from the moment I was in school. Um, and I just kind of continued that. And then when I was in high school, I actually, even before high school, my middle school and my elementary school were on the same grounds as my high school. And so when I was in middle school, we had this thing called, I think it was called preview or orientation, where we went into the high school to see what a high school is like. And I remember going into the high school debate room and just being so inspired and awed by the kids who were there. And I knew right away I wanted to be in debate. And so I was in high school debate for 4 years. I spent my Saturdays, debating uh, most favored nation status for China and pipelines through Alaska and abortion and all these like very hot button issues in American politics. And so when I went to college, I knew that at the very least I was going to double major in political science. I was originally a business major, but I always intended to at least major in political science. And then I took my first political science courses taught by a professor who was an immigrant from Bosnia, and I think she would describe herself as sort of a feminist political economist, which is sort of on the fringe of international relations. And I just thought that I want to do this. I want to be a professor. I want to do international relations. And so in college, I kind of had submitted myself to pursuing graduate education. And I took a little bit of twists and turns along the way. I did a master's degree at Columbia in climate and society because I wanted to be a political scientist who really understood the science behind climate change. And then I also flirted with law school. I took a class on environmental law in my doctoral program at UC Irvine. And I essentially decided I was going to leave grad school and become a lawyer. But it was 2009, and it was during the economic recession. And I had friends who had just graduated law school and got these really high paying, high powered jobs, and they were being given pink slips before they ever started. So I thought there's no way that I'm going to leave the comforts of grad school, take out $250,000 in debt when I already had debt from my master's degree, only to maybe not get a job or to get a job and get laid off. So I stuck with my doctoral program. I graduated, but I always kept the law as sort of one of the focal points of my research. So maybe to the chagrin, in fact, of my deceased uncle, who always said to me that I should go to law school, even though I was finishing my PhD. But so what I do is basically social science of the law, and I focus on the environment and technology.
Amazing. You are so dang articulate, Josh, and concise. It's not like you go on and say the same thing. You know how many people I interview, they say the same thing 3 times in a row because they're trying to work it out, and I appreciate it. A screenwriting teacher told me great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the
Mm.
opposite. Great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process when you're writing a document or for your research? Or what do you call what you're writing? You're writing articles, you're writing journals. What do you call it?
So typically I'll be writing a journal article
Yeah,
or a chapter in an edited volume,
right.
or perhaps a book. And
Yeah,
then occasionally I write, like a blog post for a more general audience.
right. So when you're writing, what
Mhm.
role does intention play in your creative process?
I think it plays a lot. And in fact, I would say that even though I just described my substantive focus areas of the environment and technology, that if you cut through that, What I'm really trying to do is actually explain why things are happening and expose bad arguments. So you don't need to be focused on the environment or on artificial intelligence. So I feel like I'm more of a generalist who has pegged myself to a couple of what happen to be, I think, very important issue areas. But at the end of the day, I could be writing about anything, and I have written about more American politics things from time to time, because I think that what happens is we lose sight of what is a good argument and a bad argument, and we kind of treat both of them as equivalent when they're not. But that if we can get to the truth, that we can
Yeah.
solve problems. And
Yeah.
so when I am writing something, it's often in response to what I perceive to.
Wow, you froze. Might have to re-enter. Okay, we'll have Josh back here in a second, hopefully. You can go to Josh Gellers, GELLERS.com. Okay, Josh, you're back. Thank you.
Yeah.
Some ghost in the machine froze you up, but you were continuing to say something you perceive, and that's where
Oh, okay. So I would say I'm more motivated by what I perceive to be a bad argument,
Yeah.
and trying to overcome that, whatever that might be. And it just so happens that my attention right now is directed toward um, how people talk about technology and its moral and legal status. But I mean, my whole dissertation came about actually because of more of just a pure inquiry, which was I read an article by people that I would later get to meet, which was pretty cool. And it was on this concept of a constitutional environmental right. And they talked about them all over the globe. And I thought, well, why do some countries have environmental rights in their national constitution and others don't? And that question, resulted in basically like a 4-year long project, which turned into multiple articles, a book, and so on, because I just had to know,
Yeah.
and I had to go on this journey to find out the answer.
Yeah. Brilliant. You opened up a lot there we can talk about. And Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your reader when you're writing your article?
The way that you pose that question, the way that I'm going to answer it is, I think it's a little bit more narcissistic than it is for a kind of general audience in mind or something like that. I really think, I mean, some of it is to write so that I can convince, but I'm also writing in a way to challenge myself to articulate things in a way that's both cogent and also beautiful. And so I find myself, I never really have writer's block. What I do have is sort of writer's obstacle, where I have a way that I want to say something, and I'm trying to fit it into the argument because I fall in love with the phrasing. And then it takes a lot more for me to say, well, maybe I've got to lose this and just sort of stick to my argument. because actually as a writer, and I've hopefully getting better about this, but I do tend to branch out, and even sometimes in conversation, and I have to sort of rein myself back in. So a lot of this is more of an internal struggle than it is a conscious effort to speak with a voice that's intelligible to an audience.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Just saying the word beautiful, you don't think of like journal writers or articles in your sensibility in the big picture, like that was a beautiful article. you know,
Mm-hmm.
that is important. It is both the form and the content are important. And just so to follow up on this McLuhan thing, he says everything we invent extends some humanness. Knife and fork extends our teeth. Shutter in a camera extends our eyelid. Even say non-tangible religion or philosophy could extend consciousness. What does the writing utensil extend for you? What humanness? Whether it's a pen or a keyboard, what humanness does the writing utensil extend?
Uh, just it extends the ability to articulate a thought in the hopes that it proves persuasive.
Yeah. And in that regards, Duchamp said there's no solution because there's no problem. What do you think of that line?
Well, it actually reminds me of a class I took on natural disasters, and sort of this idea that, if there's a volcano that erupts and no one's around, is it a natural disaster or is it just an event?
Yeah,
And so I think that it's the kind of social context in which something occurs that determines whether it is a problem or even a non-event in that
yeah.
case.
That's, I do have a question I never use, but that's, are the laws of nature cruel?
No,
Yeah,
no. In fact, it reminds me of a statement by an environmental ethicist, Holmes Rolston, who was talking about the possibility of rights of nature. And he says, when the human leaves nature, nature no longer has rights because
yeah,
it was an artifact of human invention. And so, yeah, I think that you can't apply a sense of morality to instinct that isn't driven by ethical decision making.
yeah. Well, that was my good chance. Are the laws of nature cruel? Josh says no. There's no right or wrong answers to any of these questions, but that one you got right.
Okay, great.
But you've said this word truth. And before we go into rights, I would love to tackle Louis Buñuel says, I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it.
See, I would disagree, and I would say that there are certain kinds of things that are more amenable to being sort of ironclad truths, but then there are other kinds of issues that are a bit murkier, um, for whom, or I guess not for whom, but issues that are murkier where and different kinds of answers can exist simultaneously, and so that there won't be any one singular truth. So I'm going
Yeah.
to diverge a little bit from maybe the strict positivists who think that there is, this one singular truth out there. I definitely believe that there are multiple truths, but I
Yeah.
also believe that there are some things out there that are more amenable to a singular truth.
It's really good because 80 to 90%, when I say the Buñuel quote, they go, that's right. And then finally, a couple years ago, someone goes, that's bullshit. Because if I'm going to seek something, it's because I want to find it.
Mm-hmm.
So then I morphed it into the question, the cliche goes, the journey's more important than the destination. Why do we have to seek or name a destination if the journey's more important?
So there's actually some psychological literature that's pretty interesting on this, where they have examined how people feel as sports fans in the lead up to a championship versus after the championship when they win it.
Yeah.
And the results show that people they report feeling less enthusiastic, less positive than they thought they would after the fact than before the championship. So it shows that there's something in the run up to an event, an
Yeah.
accomplishment that people can really sink their teeth into. I think it's hope that people really glom onto. Whereas once you finally achieved it, and I would certainly agree that for me at least, academia has kind of been a string of these, that it's very anticlimactic. That, you know, in the course of, for people who don't know, like when you defend a dissertation, in most cases, at least in places like the United States, it's an event, but it's something kind of pro forma in the sense that you have already talked with your advisor. You already know for the most part what kinds of edits you will have needed to have made. And then you do this presentation and they pass you. It's extremely rare that someone gets to the dissertation defense stage and then they fail.
Wow.
So now mine was a bit more tumultuous for reasons that were, I think, good ones. I got a job and no one had read my dissertation yet, I think. But yeah, so anyway, the point of this is that it is the process up until the moment of defense that is that the struggle that is beautiful and that you strive for. But then the day after you pass your dissertation defense, or the day after your team wins a Super Bowl, you don't feel as good as you thought you would. And that's because chasing after the dream is more significant than actually achieving it.
Yeah. And that is even something I challenge sometimes, because the people in the 20s in Paris changed the world forever. And they were called flaneurs or psychogeography. And they just wandered aimlessly and drank coffee and stumbled their toes, as Joyce said, and had an epiphany in everydayness. They weren't like, oh, I'm going to change the world. It just happened because it was part of their, what you described sort of like a hit single. When you're, you know, when you're young and you have your first hit single, then you're fucked for the rest of your life, because they're going to say, well, you got to recreate that. It's like, so on to this word truth for a couple more. This is Shelby Foote. A fact is not a truth until you love it.
I don't know if you need to love something in order for it to be a truth. It can be a hard truth. And I'll just give you probably a pretty mundane example, but say, you know, someone just isn't going to do very well in a class, you know, and I speak, you know, talking about some of my background, I remember looking at an IEP, which is this individualized educational program, from I think when I was 6 years old. So this is very early on. And it assessed my mathematical aptitude. And basically, in so many words, said, Josh is not going to be a mathematician. And they knew that when I was 6. So that was a truth that even though it wasn't certainly said to me by my parents or anything, I didn't really find myself very mathematically inclined for sort of most of my life. And math is certainly not a strong point of mine. And I've met people for whom it is, and I can see how their minds work differently, but I'm okay with that. So it's a truth. It's not one I like, but I also can appreciate that it makes me different. And it's something that makes other people very special.
So that's what a hard truth is?
To me, anyway. I mean, it's something that you don't want to accept, but you have to.
I see. You don't want to accept it, but have to. Yeah. Well, that's good. So this is Eartha Kitt. Truth is a theory that is constantly being disproved. Only lies, it seems, go on forever.
Again, I would probably push back at that suggestion. I think that there are certain things that, you know, even in our current political state, have now taken on the flavor of lies, but underneath them, there are still truths. It doesn't, the lie doesn't mask the truth forever. It just provides a kind of temporary cloaking, which makes some people feel more comfortable about avoiding the truth.
Yeah. That's perfect follow-up. Again, your ESP is just beaming. Schopenhauer. All truth passes through 3 stages. First, it's ridiculed. Secondly, it's violently opposed. Third, it's accepted as being self-evident.
Absolutely. And this is basically the trajectory of human rights in the world.
Wow.
So
How is that?
I would definitely. So I actually have one of the slides that I show in a talk that I give on more than human rights, almost proceeds in those same exact steps. What was thought to be impossible and ludicrous is challenged and contested and eventually accepted. There's a famous, so it's a monograph that was written that was meant to challenge the idea that women deserve rights. And it's famous because it relates to animal rights. It was sort of a play off of that. And it was done to sort of denigrate the idea that women's rights are a thing. And now, fast forward, through the women's liberation movement, civil rights era, we look pretty opposed to infringements upon what we consider to be sacrosanct women's rights. We have an international treaty that deals with women's rights. So we have legislation covering it. It's no longer crazy to think of women as having rights, but it used to be. It used to be the subject of ridicule and scorn. So I think we see the same kind of cycle play out time and again when we look at the evolution of human rights.
So is that cumulative or cyclical? Is this human progress? Would you call that human progress? Human moral progress that we've
I
given?
would.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
is human moral progress more cyclical or more cumulative?
So in international norms literature, one of the theorists talks about it in the way that it's almost like a corkscrew, where you're
Yeah.
never sort of static at the same point in history, and it always seems to be evolving in a progressive direction, but it is at the same time going through these sort of similar cycles.
Yeah, but I that's funny you say corkscrew or they did. I say it's like a cone. And sometimes it circles up, we're getting
Mhm.
better, and sometimes it circles down.
Yeah, sure. I could
Yeah.
see that.
What's the difference between rights and responsibilities?
Great question. Responsibilities are duties that someone has. They are the corollary to rights. One cannot have a right adequately enforced unless someone has a corresponding responsibility to see that that right is enforced. And this is also not my own, that I just came up with out of nowhere. This is based on the writing of a theorist and legal scholar named Wesley uh, um, Hofeld, who wrote about this at the early 20th century. And he calls it, this is his sort of approach to understanding legal rights. And he talks about them in terms of legal incidents. And there are this sort of a number of different things that legal scholars have attributed to rights, which he calls different sorts of legal incidents. But then there are these opposites and these correlates. And responsibilities is one of the correlates of rights. You can't have a right unless someone has a corresponding duty to see that the right is enforced.
Thanks for teaching me, Josh. How do you spell Wesley's last name?
It's Hohfeld.
Thank you.
Wesley Newcomb Holfeld.
What's the difference between rebellion and revolution?
I think rebellion tends to be more inward looking and maybe, whereas revolution may have consequences that are beneficial for a larger population. You think of rebellion as being smaller scale and maybe not with societally beneficial outcomes, at least in terms of its intent. Whereas a revolution oftentimes is on a kind of utilitarian basis, intended for the betterment of a greater number of people.
Yeah, it seems so. Rebellion is like, hey, there's something wrong. Revolution, it's in the word re-evolution. There's something wrong, and we have a new plan. Here's a new strategy.
Yeah, you can rebel against something without a plan for the future. You just don't like it.
Yeah. Utah Phillips, the folk singing activist, said, anarchy is making rules for yourself and not others. Who's entitled to make the rules?
I think ideally it would be a democratic process that people would buy into and feel is legitimate, which would warrant following those rules. But where I think you have seen whether it's at the familial level or the national level or even the international and supranational levels, that where rules break down or where there is opposition to them is where those rules seem to lack a kind of democratic legitimacy.
Yeah, here's another one I need your advice, Josh. Entitled is such a hot button word now. Who's entitled to make the rules? I could say who should make the rules,
Mhm.
who's entitled to make the rules, or who makes the rules. It's sort of like I'm trying to get the person to say, in the big picture, do we need rules? And then how is the process of forming them? You know,
So I think we need rules. I think that this is something that Thomas Hobbes talked about, right? That the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short, especially if you're a vulnerable person or in a vulnerable group, you stand to benefit from the order provided by rules, and it creates an orderly society for everyone. But as far as who is responsible for that, I think, I'll say who I don't think is responsible or shouldn't be responsible is any single individual. I think that when you upscale society to the level of complexity that we now see across the world, it is bizarre and almost absurd to me that we have entrusted individual people with a job like enforcing rules for an entire society.
yeah.
So I think it has to be some kind of democratically deliberative process, whether that is directly by the people who are affected or by proxy, people who are nominated and appointed or elected by the people who need rules to govern society.
Yeah. That selective enforcement thing is really dominant in our world today. Who's your political hero of all time? One of them.
Um, Political hero. Um, it's funny. I remember who I used to say, but I don't feel that way anymore.
Who'd you
And
used to say?
so I wrote an essay in high school for an honors program I had applied to for college, and I said it was I didn't say it wasn't my hero, but it was like a person in history I admire or something,
Yeah.
and I said um, Peter the Great.
And why, Peter? What did he do?
Uh, I think for probably doing things that create an orderly society and sort of flexing his muscle and but
Yeah.
also maintaining a civil society.
Yeah.
But I had only a very small knowledge of him at the time, and I didn't realize all the terrible things that he was associated with as well, and sort of tyranny and oppression and
Yeah.
so then later I would say the next one after that was probably Kennedy. And but as a husband and as a father, I have strong moral reservations about Kennedy's personal side of things, even though I may agree with some of his politics. And I was even really a big fan of Bill Clinton for a long time. I went to see him speak in college,
Yeah.
but with a lot of the things that have come to light about Bill Clinton, I have strong ethical reservations about touting him as any
Yeah.
kind of a hero. So um, I think that's a really challenging question to answer. I will say that I have, as a professor who's been active in his community, I have met with people and worked with people across the aisle who I have had a great deal of respect for. And I'm, maybe this is kind of biased because I'm looking at this name out of the corner of my eye. But two of the people I've worked with on environmental issues locally who were in our city council, one who is no longer in city council, is Councilwoman Randy DeFore and Councilman Matt Carlucci. And again, these are two people who are Republicans, but who are very good, decent, smart, ethical people who have the best interests of the community in mind. And I think that, being a Democrat, but working with Republicans on issues that we all agree are important has been really inspiring and eye opening for me. And I look at those people as sort of examples of politicians who sort of transcend their political party because they're just good people who want
Yeah.
to do right by their constituents.
Yeah, Josh, it's like divide and conquer. I mean, this separation is, I think it's always been there, but it seems to have flared up that there's more of this division. But again, the really bottom line question is, where did you get this need or want to be politically aware? From the way your parents raised you or on your own?
I think it's a little bit of both, in part because of the kinds of jobs my parents had. Our dinner table conversations, even if we weren't using this language, often dealt with sort of institutional failures and social injustices.
Yeah.
My mother, was a middle school media specialist, and my father was a therapist who worked with people who had both a severe mental health issue and a chemical dependency, and worked a lot with Medicare and Medicaid patients.
Yeah.
And so I heard a lot about the failings of our medical system and our educational system growing up. And it was just, that's what we talked about. And it made me feel like I
Yeah.
needed to be part in some way of the solution and work to create a better situation in life for people in my community.
Your parents must be proud of you.
I think that they are.
Way to go,
Yeah.
Josh. Okay, this is socialist John Basil Barnhill. Where the people fear the government, you have tyranny. Where the government fears the people, you have liberty. This was paraphrased in the movie V for Vendetta.
Mhm.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people. How do you personally handle false fears like the war on drugs? You can't have a war on drugs because drugs don't fight. You can't say no to drugs because drugs don't talk,
Mm.
or the war on poverty or the war on terrorism. How do you personally handle false fears?
Well, I mean, so those particular examples are really just uh, rhetorical flourishes designed to marshal resources for a particular agenda. And sometimes they're couched in solving a societal problem. Other times it's dubious that they actually represent the kind of the magnitude of the problem that they're being presented as posing. Uh, but I think that you just have to sort of stick with what you know are the things that you can influence and the things that you deeply care about, and to try and make small changes in those areas. And I have been fortunate enough in that in the 9+ years I've been here in Jacksonville, I have witnessed how the role that I've played, the people I've met who have similar goals, how we have worked together to make these small improvements in our community and to get us at least on the right track for addressing specifically environmental challenges. So I think you keep your eye on the ball and you don't really focus so much on these distractions. And I don't mean to diminish something like the people who are negatively affected by the war on drugs, but if you're someone who wants to solve some of the drug dependency issues, then that's how my father got his start. He formed a student organization at Penn State called OD, that their whole goal was to help people who were on drugs at concerts. And then he realized, as he was a college senior, I think I might want to do this as my career. I really
Wow.
like helping people who have chemical dependency issues. So it started with a problem and it turned into a career where he worked as a mental health therapist for 45 years. So he
Wow.
found his niche, his thing he cared about, and he
Yeah.
just, drilled really hard down into it and made that his whole life's work.
Yeah. That's like Zappa. Frank Zappa said, it's not a war on drugs. It should be a war on hopelessness. That's why people take drugs.
Yeah, a lot of truth there.
Yeah. And back to this truth pursuit, another one that I'm curious your thought on. Robert Evans, the movie producer. There are three sides to every story: my side, your side, and the truth, and no one is lying.
I think that to use this way, there's a lot of truth to that, because you have to accept that there's different perspectives, different way that people experience the same kind of things. and it doesn't make anyone's experience any less valid than anyone else's.
Here's my other favorite. If you make people think they're thinking, they'll love you. If you really make them think, they'll hate you.
I think that that's very astute, and I think you can see that with the scourge that is misinformation, especially during like the pandemic, and how people sort of flocked to their preferred pseudo expert. But if you actually were to engage those people and question their assumptions and their motives and the evidence that they believe in, uh, it makes them deeply uncomfortable. And the reality is, no one wants to be wrong. That is a hit to your ego. So people want to be right, and they will double down when they're wrong because the alternative is too difficult to accept.
Yeah.
So I think that that's very true.
Yeah, admitting you're wrong is heavy. That's another thing I love Frank Zappa taught me was I'm a failure, but I'm not a miserable failure. My big thing about Trump is what if Trump goes to jail and he writes a book, I'm sorry. Will you forgive him?
So I won't, because I've read, I actually did read one of his earlier books, which was horrendously written. There was an entire chapter on his hair. Um, the reality is that, going back to a point I made earlier, I mean, there are certainly people who can be redeemed, and America certainly loves a redemption story.
Yeah.
But there are people who I think are beyond the pale and have done things. I'll give you one example. Rush Limbaugh,
Yeah.
who has been sort of lionized by the right
Yeah.
after his passing. There are few people in the United States who have done as much to destroy the fabric of comedy that people had between them, irrespective of their political ideology, more than him.
Yeah.
He spent decades eroding the trust that people had in each other and making one group out to be an enemy of the other. And I think that it is a mistake to reward that legacy with naming things after him and celebrating days in his honor. At the end of your life, if you can't look back and think, I made the world a little bit better, I think, and it doesn't have to be that you cured cancer. Maybe you made things better for your family or for your neighbor or for a school district or whatever. I think you can look at him and say, he made the world worse, and we don't know when it's going to get better. And that is a tragic legacy, in my opinion.
Yeah. I understand what you said. That's really powerful. You put it well, too. And so this is a Marcel Proust question. On what occasion do you lie?
I without giving any sort of specific example, I think I have lied when I thought the truth would be too difficult for another person to bear.
Yeah.
So it was more to preserve them than anything.
Yeah. To preserve the other. Yeah. That's what I usually get is not to hurt someone else's feelings.
Mm-hmm.
So here's something that the New York Times TV critic wrote back in 2017. So, his job is to sell TV to you, but he wants to be the critic, and he writes really well. The cable news business model: conflict means urgency, and urgency means viewers glued to the channel. It seeks out arguments and pushes buttons. It's a machine designed to generate stress and negative emotion. So Trump doesn't exactly lack for that. Trump's entire career philosophy has been that fighting is humankind's most productive state, and that the fight or flight response is to be savored and cultivated. So even leaving Trump out of it, you can go there, but what is humankind's most productive state? Is conflict the human condition? And what is humankind's most productive state?
We talk about this in my international relations classes because one of the most popular and famous theories, realism, especially classical realism, is predicated on conflictual human nature being the sort of dominant approach that society has taken throughout our history, and that we can't eradicate it, and so we just have to sort of learn how to navigate those that kind of circumstance. But um, I strenuously disagree that it is our most productive, because I would say toward what end? If the
Yeah.
goal is for there to be a winner and for there to be a loser, assuming you're not the loser, then it's probably great that you're good at conflict. But I
Yeah.
think the most productive is when we are cooperating and working in harmony towards mutually beneficial goals.
Yeah.
And my parents, kind of came of age in the hippie era, and I think about a lot where many of our problems stem from the level of societal organization and how complex and difficult it is to get things done, even if it's nitty gritty, mundane things like filling a pothole or something like that. And I oftentimes think, if you look at smaller societies, even like communes, you know, there's probably problems that emerge in those situations, but it may be more feasible to have higher levels of cooperation, understanding, and to resolve conflicts when you kind of know everybody. When I say, just as a kind of another example, like one of my wife's favorite genres of TV shows is sort of kind of Hallmark small town,
Yeah.
romance type shows that are on
Yeah.
Netflix. And everyone knows each other and knows each other's business, and there's always conflict, but they're always able to get around it. They're always
Yeah.
able to get better as a result of it. And I think part of the problem that we now face, which has been exacerbated by social media, is that we have introduced an element of ontological distance between people. So it allows you to sort of hide behind your keyboard and your computer screen and say horrible things to someone in a completely different part of the country or the world and never suffer the consequences. Whereas if you were in a much smaller society and we call this iterated games, you knew that tomorrow I'm going to have to see that person again, it might counsel against saying a really harmful negative thing to that person. So some of our problems are a direct result of the scale at which humans are now currently organized.
Yeah. Josh, I asked for 90 minutes and it's almost 90. I'd love to do a part two because we only got through maybe a third of the questions. So this could be 2 or 3 months down the line. But do you have a few more minutes to close out or you got to end now?
I probably should head out now just because I have my wife is currently taking care of our daughter, and I think she may need another
Okay.
set of hands because we've got some things going on this weekend. But
Okay.
I'm
Because
happy to revisit this in the future.
yeah, let's revisit it because just what you said brought up so many things. I wanted to tell you in regards to your wife's TV shows. That's like I think that is similar in my life too. My wife loves rom-coms
Mm-hmm.
more over, in I heard this cliche once that could be true. It says if you gossip or you complain, you live longer. So you get it out of your system. So like saying the two older women sit in the town square and they gossip about everybody. What's the difference between them being concerned and them gossiping? I mean, we know we can say the words like, oh, we don't want to do mean spirited gossip, but
Mm-hmm.
indeed it's us showing a word you brought up earlier is empathy. So I mean, just in closing, how do you define what is empathy in your concise Josh articulate way? I mean, what is it in what we've talked about?
I would say empathy is um, the capacity for honest and legitimate care of anything outside oneself.
Yeah.
And so that means it's not exclusive to people. You could feel empathy toward animals, you could feel empathy toward nature. Um, and so it's a kind of pure emotion.
Yeah.
It's very related to altruism, but I think it's the glue that sort of exists in the ether that allows us to relate to the rest of the world outside ourselves.
Yeah. To relate to others. It's amazing because, you started, what's the best thing for a human being is to be part of something greater than self. So it will be fun in part two. We can really delve into this thing about identity.
Mhm.
Both Krishnamurti and McLuhan both said violence is the human search for identity. So I'd love to go into that. What does self mean? And then I don't know if you've ever studied Maria Gimbutas or Riane Eisler, Chalice and the Blade. Maria Gimbutas was the anthropologist who kind of tried to prove that we're not violent by
Mhm.
nature. That everybody goes, well, it's built in us to be war mongers, and fight and protect our food or whatever. But this has really been enlightening for me because it is a sort of stupid question when you say, is it more innate or more invented? Because it's such a, a mixed bag of how these things come about. But
Mhm.
for someone who's studied, back to your word, research this, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much, Josh.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to
Yeah.
be here.
Even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever.
Sounds good.
And you'll book part two.
Yes.
Okay,
All right. Take
thanks.
care.